Let's talk about Elantris, Brandon Sanderson's first published book and his first book in the Cosmere. Obviously, Brandon Sanderson is one of the highest acclaimed authors, and especially fantasy authors of our generation. With Elantris, he published his first book in 2005, which is an epic fantasy book set in the Cosmere, which is his universe where all of his epic fantasies mostly are set in, apart from the Wheel of Time books he wrote. In this book, we have the city of Elantris, which is in the kingdom of Arelon. 10 years ago, Elantris used to be the capital city of Arelon, and its inhabitants were mostly people who had magical abilities, but 10 years ago something happened that is now referred to as the fall of Elantris, and now all the people who used to be these magical human beings now have this illness called the Shroud, and the Elantrians now are basically suffering from an illness, and they are essentially like zombies, like their hearts don't beat, their blood doesn't flow, and they get a very patchy skin, like their flesh looks rotten, and they get these black spots on their skin. And also, these Elantrians, when they get hurt, their wounds don't heal. And in general, Elantris as a city, which used to be one of the most beautiful cities in this world, it has now become a very dirty city that has a lot of like slime everywhere. In Arelon, every person that gets taken by this illness is thrown into Elantris, and they have to spend their lives there, with the problem being obviously that their wounds don't heal, and also they don't just die. Like, I think the only way they can die is by being burned, but they basically live for an eternity in that city now. And in that city, obviously, there is a lot of chaos going on. There is no food that is being supplied through the city, so it is a very interesting premise to see what happened to the city, and also how the people who live there spend their lives. Apart from Arelon, we have two more kingdoms. One is Teod and one is Fjorden. Fjorden is a kingdom that is trying to take over the whole continent of where these three kingdoms are set. And Fjorden is a very religiously motivated state which is trying to convert all the people of this continent to their religion, which is called Shu-Dereth. The main religion in Teod and Arelon is Shu-Korath, which is related to Shu-Dereth, like they are derived from the same religion, but they have very different principles. In this book, we follow three main characters. The first main character is the Crown Prince of Arelon, called Raoden. And on the second page of this book, we find out that Raoden is taken by the Shayod, which is the illness. That means he becomes an Elantrian, and hence he is thrown into Elantris, and we follow him in Elantris. The second main character is Serene, who is the princess of Teod, and she was actually meant to marry Prince Raoden in a political marriage so that Arelon and Teod would be allies and could fight Fjorden together. We see Serene as she arrives in Kay, which is the capital of Arelon. When she arrives there, she is told that Raoden died recently. Due to her marriage contract, actually, she's not allowed to leave. Like, her marriage is valid even if Raoden dies. So we see how she lives in Kay and how she deals with the nobility in Arelon. And our third main character is called Hrathen. He is a Gjorn, which is a very high-level priest of Shu-Dereth. So he is a person from Fjorden. He is sent to Arelon to convert all the citizens of Arelon to Shu-Dereth, and his aim is to do this without violence, so that Fjorden doesn't have to start a war against Arelon. And these are the main three characters we follow. And in the beginning, these are basically three quite separate arcs. They intertwine as the story goes on. But this is the main setup of the story. Now, for my spoiler-free thoughts on this story, I think the world that is introduced in this book is very interesting. I think there is not too much history beyond the last 10, 20 years maybe, which is maybe an issue for some people. Like, I personally like if there is a lot of history that we know about the world, but I think because this is just one book, it wasn't necessary. And I think the premise of the story is very interesting, that I didn't mind the fact that the main history is just for the last 20 years or so. Also, there is a very interesting mystery in this story regarding Elantris itself and what happened to Elantris and why the Elantrians, who used to be these magical magical human beings, are now these people who are taken by an illness. And we get this mystery throughout the book on trying to find out what exactly happened, which is quite entertaining, and which is, for me personally, this was the story that got me invested into the story early on. And we have some very interesting character arcs. I think especially Hrathen has a very interesting arc. I would say that the characters are a bit simple, like they aren't the most complex characters you find in fantasy. I would say especially Serene and Raoden are quite simple, which is done on purpose. There are in the appendix of the story, there is a postscript by Brandon Sanderson where he tells us that this was on purpose. He didn't want to have these characters be too complex, but he wanted to show, this is the first time these characters face some complex issues in their life. And I would say this applies mainly to Raoden, but also to Serene. What I really liked about this story is the side characters. I do think that a lot of side characters are introduced a bit too quickly. Like there were 2-3 chapters where I had some issue remembering who everybody was, but there are some really cool side characters, like cool in the sense of as a character, not that they're good people. I really like Galadon, who is an Elantrian who becomes Raoden's friend pretty quickly, and I really liked his character. The people in Serene's arc, like the nobility of Arelon, also has some very interesting characters, especially, I would say, Royale and Shuden. I really like those two characters. My main issue with this story was the pacing. So this story has 3 parts, and the first part is like 300 pages, the second part is 150 pages, and the last part is like 60 pages. I think the story starts off very interestingly. Like, we get a very short prologue, we get 3 rather quick introduction chapters to the 3 main characters. In general, the story picks up quite interestingly, but then some of the arcs slow down significantly, and the first half of the book is, I wouldn't say extremely slow. It just feels like the focus is a lot about world building and also setting up side characters, and a lot of our main characters are just planning stuff and not actually doing a lot of stuff. So I had an issue with this. I talked about this a bit more in my wrap-up for February. I don't want to talk about this too much here because it wasn't as big an issue as it sounded in that video. Like, I had an issue with the pacing, and the main issue with that was just that for the first half of the book, when I put it down, I didn't feel like picking it up necessarily. I still did, but it wasn't like I had to know what happened next. But it was still an interesting enough story, so it isn't that big of issue. I just think it is worth pointing out that if you don't like stories that have a rather slow pacing in the middle, then maybe you'll have a problem getting through the book. But I have to say, about the halfway point, so before even the first part ends, the pace of the story switches. I think it was chapter 20, where the story just picked up a lot of pace, and then it never slowed down after that. So I think if you can push yourself to get through the halfway point, then you're in for a very interesting and, I would say, quite fast-paced story. For me personally, the second act was very strong, and I really liked the third act, but I think it was a bit too fast. Like, a lot of stuff happened in the third act, and it wrapped up very quickly, and I would have liked if we could have spent a bit more time there. All in all, I would say trimming down the first act a bit, especially for me personally, Serene's chapters, they tended to be longer than Raoden's and Hrathen's chapters. They could have been shortened a bit, and for the pages you save in the first act, you could have put maybe like 20-30 more pages in the third act to explain more what is happening, and maybe leave a bit more time towards the end after the climax of the story. And related to the third act, I think at the end there were some convenient plot progression tactics used that could have been explained better. That's why I think the 20-30 pages more would have helped them. I don't think that these convenient things are necessarily done just for the sake of it. I think you could say they are well thought out. I just think a lot of stuff happens very quickly that it feels like, okay, it's too fast a bit, and I would have liked a bit more explanation why stuff is happening. But yeah, overall I have to say all the negative points I mentioned here are only slight issues. They are not major issues apart from the pacing. Regarding the pacing, I think you have to commit to reading like part 1 at least of the book to actually maybe like it. Like if you're not hooked in the first 5-6 chapters, I think you have to give it until like chapter 20 or even 27 or so to really hook you. Yeah, and I would say even if you aren't hooked into the story immediately, I think it is worth sticking around because the payoff in the end is very good. I rated this book at 4 out of 5 stars. I think it's a very solid debut novel, and it's a very interesting fantasy story. That's for my spoiler-free thoughts. I will go into spoilers for some time now, but I will leave a timestamp here so you can come back for my overall thoughts at the end of the book. All right, let's talk a little bit about spoilers. So what I really enjoyed in this book was the exploration of the magic, and also how the magic in Arelon is linked to its geography, how the magic system in this world generally is set up. And regarding that, I also like in the appendix this Ars Arcanum, where the magic system is explained a bit more, so even if you didn't understand it too exactly in the book, you can still read it in the appendix after the book. Don't read it during the book because it is spoilery, I would say, slightly. Like in this story, obviously Raoden is trying to figure out what happened with the magic, why Elantris fell. So I wouldn't say that you should check the appendix before you read the book, but I think after you're done, it's a nice overview on how the magic works. This book had some interesting setup for future sequels that have actually been confirmed by Brandon Sanderson. I think he said he plans on this being a trilogy. Like, this book is very good as a standalone. Like, it doesn't need sequels, but I think there is enough interesting stuff left at the end of the book that you could still do 1 or 2 more books. And especially the plotline with Fjorden, because we didn't actually get a war between Fjorden and Arelon. We got a hint of a war at the end. We haven't seen like actually Fjorden being fought off. So Fjorden is still the most powerful kingdom, but there is enough setup for the next book to explore these ideas more. Regarding Raoden's arc, I thought it was slightly convenient at points. For example, him going into Elantris, figuring out the magic, figuring out a lot of stuff rather quickly, which nobody has figured out in 10 years, and especially considering that there are some original Elantrians who knew how the magic worked, who should be in Elantris. Even those couldn't figure that out, and I feel like Raoden figuring it out seems a bit convenient. And also the way he recruit all the Elantrians basically to work with him is also maybe, I liked how it was done, I think, but it was a bit convenient. But I still enjoyed his arc. Like in the beginning of the book, Raoden's arc was what kept me coming back. I think his arc is set up very well, and I don't think there is a bad Raoden chapter. And his chapter also has some action already in the first act, so I think it's still a cool arc. But there's some convenient points throughout, and especially towards the end, when it gets very quick, he solves a lot of problems rather quickly. I had an issue with the fact that his character is not too complex, but after reading the postscript, I get why it was done. Like, Brandon Sanderson didn't want to write this like typical fantasy character that has this troubled past. He wanted to do somebody who doesn't have this troubled past, who still has an interesting backstory, but really the first major issue that he has to deal with in the world, that's what we are focusing on. So I personally would have liked a bit more backstory, but I get why there isn't a lot. But this issue for me is more with Serene's arc, because I feel like her arc is really too convenient, because obviously Serene comes into Arelon, finds out Raoden is dead, and now she has to live in Arelon and somehow has to deal with the nobility in Arelon. And for me personally, Serene is just a bit too dominating too quickly over Arelon's ability. Like, we have her group where she immediately after her first meeting becomes the leader, essentially, which I think somewhat makes sense, but I feel like it was too early. And also, once she started talking realistically with the king succumbed to her very quickly, which also made him seem weak. And I know he's supposed to be a weak king, but he has still somehow managed to keep Arelon's nobility under his grasp for 10 years. So I feel like it was a bit too easy for Serene to just come in and have such a big effect on the nobility, which makes the nobility seem rather weak. I didn't like that Serene's chapter were used for a lot of world building and introducing a lot of side characters. Like, I think it was chapter 14 and 17 that were Serene chapters that were both like over 15 pages, maybe something like 20 pages. And a lot of Serene chapters are on the longer side, and a lot of them have like a lot of world building and some character introductions in the beginning, and then when we get to the interesting point towards the end, they end, and then we don't follow up on the interesting part until quite a bit later. So the two scenes I had the most issues with were the party at Telri's house, which went on quite a while, and I mean, it was still interesting to see these characters, but I found like, okay, I'm reading 20 pages of a party, which for me personally, wasn't interesting enough to keep me invested in the chapter. And this chapter was followed up by the chapter where he started teaching fencing to the women in Arelon's nobility, and I also thought that scene went on for too long. Like, those two chapters were the only two that stand out to me where I would say, okay, these were too long, that not a lot happened in those chapters, and these two scenes just took too long. I mean, Serene is still an interesting character, but I think she's, of the main three, she would be my least favorite. Now, Hrathen's arc, I think, is probably the most interesting one. It was interesting from the beginning, but the more you got into his arc, the more interesting it got. I think in his arc, we have a very interesting exploration of belief and religion, and we see him along with Dilaf, who is essentially a counterpart to the way Hrathen believes in Shu-Dereth, and Dilaf has a completely different outlook, but he still believes in Shu-Dereth. Like, Hrathen is more somebody who believes because he thinks that this religion is very logical and it makes sense, and his belief comes more from a logical understanding, but Dilaf's is more of an emotional belief. It's very interesting to see how these two play off each other, and obviously towards the end, the revelations towards the end are very interesting. What I did not like about Hrathen's arc is a small part, but towards the end it is revealed that he loves Serene, which I thought was weird. I don't think there was any setup for it. I don't see any particular reason for it, other than Serene is a strong female character, which may be okay, but I think they didn't have enough interactions for me to say that this made sense. All in all, I would say Hrathen had a very interesting redemption arc, and I really enjoyed everything he did in this book, and I liked how his character ended up. Regarding the ending of the story, as I already said, I thought it was a bit too quick and a lot of things happened very conveniently, but I enjoyed the ending. I think obviously you can say it was a bit predictable what would happen, but I think a lot of the plot twists were interesting and unpredictable enough that even if the ending is a bit predictable, that it isn't too bad. And all in all, I think it was a very interesting story, and I think this was a very incredible debut novel. Alright, now let's talk a bit about my overall thoughts regarding this book. For me personally, I would say this is a highly recommended read. I think this story is very interesting. It's an interesting fantasy story, and it shows that Brandon Sanderson already in his debut novel has a lot of interesting ideas, some interesting characters, and yeah, his plots are very interesting, and already we can see that his endings are incredibly fast-paced and are incredibly good. I would say that maybe this isn't the best choice for your first Sanderson or Cosmere book. I personally read it first because I like to go in publication order, so I'm reading all the Cosmere books this year in publication order. For me, it was fine, but I think if you do not like slow pacing and you are a very plot-driven reader, I would say maybe this isn't the best book to start off. I personally knew that I would give him at least 4 books to convince me, so yeah, for me this wasn't a big issue. But yeah, I would still highly recommend that you read this book. Okay, that was it for my review of Elantris. I hope you liked the video. If you did, leave a like and leave a subscribe, and hit the notify bell next to the subscribe button. If you are interested in more of my videos, I will be doing Mistborn next regarding Sanderson, so yeah, look out for that. I will blend in some related videos here if you're interested in more of my content. So yeah, check those out. Thanks for watching and goodbye.